Work Wellness Institute is transforming research into workplace performance and health. As an organization, we function throughout the complete cycle of turning research into practice, mobilizing knowledge as a research institute, community partner, funder, and educational provider. Our mission of creating safe, healthy, and inclusive workplaces for all is our driving motivation. Learning is a lifelong journey to adapt to the forever changing needs of the workplace. Whether you are a leader, a professional, an academic, or a student, we provide high-quality resources that are evidence-based, topical, and relevant to all industries. Choose the Work Wellness Institute as your learning journey partner and become a member to gain full access to our diverse knowledge mobilization programming, including lectures on demand, e-curriculum, 3 distinct certification opportunities, and more. Continue to learn and connect with the Work Wellness Institute and see how we can support transforming research into performance and health for your workplace.
Thank you again to everyone for joining. I will officially welcome everyone to our session today and share a very happy good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you may be signing in from today. I would like to once again officially welcome everyone to our session on educational and work experiences of women with disabilities. My name is Elizabeth White, and I am the manager of programs with the Work Wellness Institute, and I'm here just to aid in hosting and moderating today's session. I am going to take a couple of moments just to acknowledge the purpose of this webinar today, and we're very excited for you all to have taken the time to join us today as we come together in celebration of the upcoming International Women's Day. This global day of recognition, held annually on March 8th, this coming Saturday, honors the incredible social, economic, cultural, and political achievements of women while calling for action to accelerate gender equality. The United Nations has chosen this year's theme to be for all women and girls, rights, equality, empowerment, reminding us that progress must be inclusive, ensuring that no woman or girl is left behind. This day is an opportunity for reflection on the strides made and the work still ahead. Today, we not only celebrate the contributions of women worldwide, but also reaffirm our commitment to a future that is diverse, equitable, and free from bias. Together, let's use this moment to accelerate action, drive meaningful change, and forge a world where every woman and girl can thrive. This webinar is made possible through the support of our funders, partners, as well as memberships to the Work Wellness Institute. And we, of course, would like to take a moment to thank our advisory committees and our speakers who contribute to this webinar series. And of course, we would not be here today without the commitment of our wonderful speakers and subject matter experts. So we thank them profusely. I also would like to acknowledge that I have the privilege to live and work on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam nations. And now I'm very excited to move right into the main event today, and we're excited to be joined by Dr. Rubab Arim. Rubab received her PhD in Human Development, Learning, and Culture from the University of British Columbia. She is now chief in the Social Analysis and Modeling Division at Statistics Canada. Her research expertise includes the use of population-based data to study policy-relevant issues for vulnerable populations, including children, youth, and women with disabilities, with a particular focus on social determinants of health. Recently, she has been involved in Statistics Canada's Disaggregated Data Action Plan to better highlight the experiences of women with disabilities, with an emphasis on better data for better decision making. Thank you so much for joining us today, and I'm very happy to pass things over to you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Well, I'd like to start by thanking the Work Wellness Institute for inviting Statistics Canada to give a presentation on educational and work experiences of women with disabilities to celebrate the upcoming International Women's Day. You may have already read somewhere that the theme for this year is Accelerate Action to address the challenges women face in their personal and professional lives. And today we are going to look into the lives of women with disabilities together. Before I start the presentation, I also would like to acknowledge that this presentation includes many analysts' work at Statistics Canada, even though you just see my name on the first slide. And I'd like to acknowledge their names and their work, which are cited throughout the presentation, but also included in our references slide at the end of our presentation. My objective today is to present Statistics Canada's recent research findings and discuss barriers and accommodations for better educational and employment experiences. I have four main topics. First, I'd like to start by describing how disability is defined and measured in the Canadian Survey on Disability, or the CSD in short, which is a national survey that gathers information about the lived experiences of youth and adults whose everyday activities may be limited due to a long term condition or a health problem. Next, I'd like to apply an intersectional lens to the national data on disability and women and delve into the disability rates, dynamics, types of disabilities, severity of disability, their educational attainment and experiences, as well as employment rates and income. Here, I'd like to note that I will sometimes compare women with disabilities to men with disabilities, other times to women without disabilities, or comparisons among with different types of disabilities, for example. Also, some figures will represent statistics from 2022, others from 2017, so let's say pre-pandemic era, and yet some information will include a comparisons between the 2 years. Thirdly, I'd like to discuss barriers to employment and work experiences. And finally, I will conclude and mention some future directions in analysis and research. Let's start with the definition of disability in the Canadian Survey on Disability. So, since 2012, the Canadian Survey on Disability has been the official source of data on disability among Canadians aged 15 years and over. The CSD defines disability as a social disadvantage that emerges in the context of social barriers that limit or increase the difficulty of daily activities among persons with impairments or health conditions. So, in the context of employment, for example, persons with disabilities may face multiple barriers to employment, including constraints or education and training, misperceptions about their ability to be productive workers, biases in the hiring process, inaccessible workplaces, public spaces, and transportation, unmet needs for accommodations or assistive technologies, and finally, workplace discrimination. And my hope is really to shed some light on each of these topics throughout my presentation today. In 2022, disability rates, so those would be the red bars you are seeing on the figure, were generally higher among women, 30%, than among men, 24%. And in fact, this was the case in 2017, so before the pandemic as well, which you can see men 20% versus women 24%, and these are the blue bars. If we continue to compare the blue bars with the red bars, we can see that the largest increases in disability occurred among younger women, specifically those aged 15 to 24, with an increase from 16% to 25%. This increase may be partially due to the fact that mental health related disabilities increased from 11% in 2017 up to 19% in 2022. There may be various reasons, but of course, the first one that comes to mind is the COVID-19 pandemic. The conventional view of disability is that it is persistent and unchanging. However, many persons with disabilities may experience periods of good health interrupted by periods of their limitations. So it's on again, off again episodes. Four groups of persons with different dynamic disabilities were identified in the 2017 CSD. The figure here shows that while recurrent, so those with periods of 1 month or more without any activity limitations, are more commonly reported in younger than older ages. Progressive disabilities, so those with declines in the ability to do daily activities, are more commonly reported at older than younger ages. When we look at different types of disabilities, the most commonly reported types of disabilities are pain and mental health related, followed by mobility and flexibility types of disabilities among women. I'd like to note that among men with disabilities, the top five pretty much very similar in terms of their percentages as well. So there are no differences between men and women in terms of disability types, not really. One additional remark I'd like to highlight here is that about 72% of women had co occurring disabilities. And to be specific, about 4 in 10 had four or more disability types at the same time. In terms of disability severity, as expected, we observe milder disabilities more at younger ages and more severe disabilities more at older ages. The CSD asks a series of questions about the main condition which causes disability. One question focuses on whether the underlying cause of their condition is work related, including accidents or injuries at work, stress or violence in the workplace, exposure to loud noises or chemicals. In 2022, 19% of women with disabilities aged 25 to 64 years reported that the cause of their medical condition was work related. The figure was higher, about 30% among men with disabilities. The purpose of this slide is that the onset of disability, particularly early disability onset, is an important consideration. And we really need to focus on girls and young women with disabilities to better understand their barriers to education. What this table shows that for some types of disabilities, onset can be still relatively at younger ages. For example, if we focus on mental health related disabilities, the average age of onset is about 13 for those aged 15 to 24, and 27, so still relatively at a younger age, among those 15 years and older. If we look at learning disabilities, it also follows a similar pattern, where the average age of onset is relatively at younger ages, 26 in this case, among women with disabilities aged 15 years and older. The lower educational attainment of persons with disabilities might be attributable to early onset, together with barriers to educational attainment, including inaccessible schools and transportation, services and policies, such as lack of access to early education, negative attitudes, such as social inclusion, as well as their health condition, which may delay their school completion. Speaking of educational attainment, what we know is that women with disabilities, and this would be true or similar for men with disabilities as well, they are less likely to have a bachelor's degree or above and more likely to have no certificate, diploma, or degree. In CSD 2017, about 50% of women with disabilities aged 15 to 34 were in school at the time of the survey, and about 29% of younger women with disabilities had a more severe disability, so severe or very severe. What the table shows that many women with disabilities had unmet needs for building modifications, such as accessible buildings, residences, or classrooms, and many younger women with more severe disabilities also lacked access to specialized transportation to school. Among women who were currently or who were in school at the time of the survey or attended the school in the past 5 years, at the time of the survey again, 28% of those with milder disabilities discontinued their education, and about 5% were due to unmet needs for assistive devices or support. In comparison, 68% of those with more severe disabilities discontinued their education, and 21% were due to unmet needs for assistive devices or support. Disability influenced the choice of career paths as well, for 37% of women with milder disabilities and 59% of those with more severe disabilities. Social experiences, including feeling left out and being bullied, were also commonly reported, particularly among those with more severe disabilities. And we know that there's a large literature on peer rejection that may influence the development of interpersonal skills in the future. Here, I'd like to note one thing. Discontinued education does not necessarily mean that they do not go back to school. Some of these persons who discontinued their education may have already returned to school at the time of the survey or may return indeed in the future. However, what we know is that delays in school completion are bound to influence the transition to employment. Let's now turn our attention to employment. If we focus on employment rates among women aged 25 to 34, while comparable percentages of women with milder disabilities and those without disabilities are employed, so that would be 78% versus 74%, the figure is much lower at 43% among women with more severe disabilities. And this makes sense when we remind ourselves the information we just saw on the previous slide in relation to their educational experiences. Education indeed plays an important role because if you look at the table, the data show that the employment gap between women with and without disabilities becomes smaller at higher educational attainment. In fact, when we compare women with and without disabilities, among those with a bachelor's degree or higher, we observed similar percentages of employed women regardless of their disability status. I'd like to highlight that those with more severe disabilities are often at a more disadvantage, but as I mentioned before, the gap is narrowing with higher educational attainment. An interesting research question is whether disability dynamics matter for employment. What this chart shows that among women with disabilities aged 25 to 54 years, recurrent disabilities are associated with a smaller disadvantage in employment, whereas progressive and fluctuating disabilities are associated with larger disadvantages in employment. And disability dynamics, as you can see, matter less in employment among women aged 55 to 64 years, which makes sense as this age group is really retirement age group or representing those who are transitioning to retirement. For many persons with disabilities, full-time employment is not an option because their condition limits the amount of work they can do. In these circumstances, part-time employment is a form of self-accommodation that prevents them from being detached from the labor force. This chart shows results for all persons with disabilities, with results being similar between men and women, which I'd like to note. Nearly one half of persons with disabilities opt for part-time employment because of their health condition. So you can see this is about 30%, or because of personal preference, which is about 18%. When we consider severity of disability, we know that part time jobs are more commonly reported among women with more severe disabilities. The downside of part time employment is its association with lower employment quality. In 2020, about 22% of Canadians person with disabilities, so both women and men who had part-time jobs reported unfavorable employment conditions on indicators such as job insecurity, income insecurity, skill mismatch, workplace safety, and pension benefits. So something to keep in mind when we talk about part time employment. In terms of employment income, generally speaking, persons with disabilities earn less than persons without disabilities, regardless of their sex. So, women or men, it doesn't matter. What the chart here shows that differences are usually larger at lower employment income brackets. But differences between those who are working full year, full time, become negligible. So if we look at the numbers here on the right side, it's about 60,000 regardless of their disability status when we compare full year and full time workers' median employment income. There are more women without disabilities than women with disabilities who are working full year, full time. This is 46% for women without disabilities compared with 38% of women with disabilities. An interesting study in a couple of years ago compared age earnings profiles of women with and without childhood onset disabilities. In this chart, you can see that earnings increase at a similar pace until both groups reach their mid 20s. Both groups experience slightly slowdowns, let's say, in their earnings growth from age 25 to age 35, which is really the primary childbearing age. However, the earnings of women with childhood onset disabilities grow slower when they are in their 30s and 40s and even start declining sooner compared with women without childhood onset disabilities. Now, overall, these estimated age earnings profiles show that the annual earnings gap between the two groups observed at the beginning of their working careers continues to widen until individuals reach the peak of their lifetime earnings profile, so sometime in their late 40s. And in fact, we do know that at age 48, the average annual earnings gap for women with and without childhood onset disabilities is almost 5 times the earnings gap at age 20. With information from the Canadian Survey on Disability, we were also able to know how many women with disabilities have work potential. This is important for policy considerations. With work potential, refers to persons with disabilities who are currently not employed, but who could work in a scenario where there's no discrimination, there's full accessibility, and full accommodations. In such a scenario, we found that an additional 400,000 women with disabilities aged 25 to 64 years could have been employed in 2022. Of course, we can also observe those without work potential, and this refers to persons with disabilities who are either completely retired or whose health condition completely prevents them from working, and no workplace accommodation would enable them to work. And we had about 600,000 individuals without work potential among women with disabilities. When we talk about work potential, the other side of the coin is about hiring. A well researched topic in this area is related to why employers are reluctant to hire persons with disabilities. Researchers identified individual as well as organizational biases or issues. For example, at the individual level, they found that disability was perceived as poor health and reduced capacity to work. Other biases include persons with disabilities are assumed to prefer not to work. They are considered to be less productive than workers without disabilities, and they are expected to be frequently absent from work. At the organizational level, one of the identified issues was related to no knowledge, training, or policies on how to manage the needs of persons with disabilities. Other concerns were related to the cost of accommodations and health insurance, the attitudes of co-workers, and how to integrate persons with disabilities into the workplace, and the attitudes of clients or customers. So, lots of food for thought, I think. Let's now look into work experiences of women with disabilities aged 20 to 54 years. The CSD asked respondents who were in the labor force whether their health condition ever led them to change their work arrangements. And about 48% of women with milder disabilities and 78% of women with more severe disabilities reported a change in their work arrangements. And these included their condition limiting their current work, changing the amount of work they do, or taking a leave of absence. And these changes, as you can see on the chart, were much more commonly reported among women with more severe disabilities. Work discrimination among women with disabilities aged 20 to 54 years can be commonly reported. For example, among women with more severe disabilities, almost 6 out of 10 reported feeling disadvantaged or their employers seeing them as disadvantaged. Notably, about 1 in 10 women with more severe disabilities reported being denied a job interview, and about 2 in 10 reported being denied a job or a promotion. In the last part of my presentation, I'd like to focus on workplace accommodations, WPA in short, because these help eliminating barriers to employment. Workplace accommodations generally refer to adjustments to jobs or work environments that remove barriers to employment and enable persons with disabilities to work, and not just work, but work productively by fully utilizing their skills. And these accommodations may range from work arrangements to organizational policies. In 2017 and 2022, needs for workplace accommodations were commonly reported among persons with disabilities aged 25 to 64 years. Indeed, a larger percentage of employed women than men with disabilities reported needs for workplace accommodations, although unmet needs were not different between men and women. But unmet needs were more prevalent among persons with more severe disabilities than those with milder disabilities. And this finding is certainly not surprising given that we know about the vulnerability about this group. In 2022, the most common workplace accommodations were modified hours, duties, working from home, modified workstation, and special chair or back support. But perhaps a more important question is whether these needs were met. And on the right side of the slide, you can see the results. For example, the last line indicates that almost half had unmet need for a special chair or back support. And this compares with about 3 in 10 having an unmet need for modified work hours or working from home. Several reasons were reported for not asking for needed workplace accommodations. The most commonly reported reasons were being uncomfortable asking, fearing of negative outcomes, and not wanting to disclose the need for accommodation. These results provide useful insights for achieving accessibility by design. One question of interest is how do unmet workplace accommodations needs may affect employment? Our study aimed to shed light on this and show that unmet workplace accommodation needs are associated with a lower employment rate, and this association was similar between women and men with disabilities. Of note, the employment rate of persons with more severe disabilities without unmet workplace accommodation needs was similar to that of persons with milder disabilities. So the bottom part of this slide shows that 59% of persons with more severe disabilities and unmet needs were employed, compared with 81% of their counterparts without unmet needs. And if we look at the milder disability group, it was 68% of persons with milder disabilities and unmet needs were employed, compared with 83%. So 81 and 83 are bolded because it really shows that there are some consequences of having unmet workplace accommodations. And if we can remove them, we achieve a successful employment rate. We observed a similar association with age as well, meaning probability of employment was lower at each age group with unmet needs compared with those without unmet needs. So the important point to note in these slides is that unmet workplace accommodation needs have similar consequences in terms of employment, regardless of the gender or sex, regardless of the age, and regardless of the severity of the disability of the person. In conclusion, I'd like to leave you with three key messages. Number one, higher education is an equalizer. Improving the educational experiences of women with disabilities can be a mechanism for better employment outcomes and earnings. Number two, employment disadvantages vary among women with disabilities. Women with fluctuating, progressive, and more severe disabilities are more likely to face disadvantages in employment. And finally, workplace accommodations enable employment, regardless of individual sociodemographic as well as disability characteristics. In forward looking, the following topics may be fruitful endeavors. First, monitoring the increase in mental health related disabilities among women aged 15 to 24 years in 2022. Will it further increase? Will it decline given that we are past pandemic, or remain stable post COVID? So these will shed light on potential consequences for integration into labor market among this young cohort of women, but also accommodations for mental health related disabilities. Secondly, future research may monitor the school experiences and the transition to employment among younger women, particularly for those with early onset disabilities and those with mental health related disabilities. And as we've seen before, because early onset disabilities may lead to negative school experiences, they may have adverse consequences for employment across the life course. And finally, future research may examine the role of disability dynamics in employment and the factors that improve work potential, including workplace accommodations. This is in relation to the fact that accessibility in workplaces starts with identifying, removing, but also preventing barriers to accessibility. And here is the slide that I mentioned of all my colleagues who contributed to this work. And if you do need any further information, please do not hesitate to contact me. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much for sharing all of that data. I feel like there, as you mentioned throughout the presentation, a lot of food for thought there and a lot of things to take in and consider as we move forward in supporting the employment and educational endeavors of women with disabilities. I'll just take a quick moment to remind everyone that both the chat and Q&A function is open, so don't hesitate to send things through as we continue the discussion at this last segment of the presentation. But I will get right into things with our first question here. So something that you meant, obviously, as we've seen throughout, there are various barriers in the workplace, in the educational system, that women with disabilities and all people with disabilities are facing. So what, from your experience, research, and expertise, what are some maybe larger thinking shifts? Sometimes we do look to a little bit of policy change or a little bit of training or whatever, but those larger systemic shifts that organizations can look to make to maybe move from an accommodation based approach, which, as you mentioned, can kind of have barriers inherently there, and move into more of that accessibility or universal design approach. As you mentioned, sometimes the disability is really, that's not the barrier, is that the workplace just hasn't been set up for someone to be successful at work. So if you could speak to that.
Absolutely. Thank you, Elizabeth. And it's I have to mention that you're kind of like giving the answers as well when you are asking the questions. Um, but from my own experience as an employee at Statistics Canada, or actually in the government of Canada, one thing I can share that we do have plans, Road to Accessibility. And those Road to Accessibility plans are very much useful because they try to achieve all the pillars. How do we get to that accessibility by design? How do we achieve the four pillars of accessibility? Because, as you said, it's not just about hiring, or it's not just about changing the interview questions, or providing, like just let's say something in the building. It is considering all of these at the same time, whether it's information technology or the building modifications or the relationships, inclusion, attention to diversity, attention to cognitive biases. So how do we put all together in a plan to make sure that we have accessibility by design, inclusion by design, and diversity by design?
Oh, sorry, just to confirm, is that roadmap? Is that what you said it's
Yes,
called?
so
Is
we do have road to accessibility
Road to
plans.
Accessibility.
I have to say the full right word may not be that, but I'd be happy if anybody contacts me. I'd be happy to share, because I do know that these plans are actually publicly shared on
Oh,
the
wonderful.
department's website, and they do provide very useful information in terms of how we, government organizations, would like to achieve accessibility.
Okay, that's wonderful, and hopefully, yes, like you mentioned, we can share those links perhaps in some further communications post this event. I know throughout this presentation, just moving forward in the questions, obviously the intersectionality that was highlighted today would be women with disabilities. How has research also evolved to include the many layers of intersectionality that can come into play? So perhaps as an example, women, disability, and race, women, disability, age, all of those different kind of factors that can come in and affect the numbers even more or create more barriers.
That's a very interesting point of view as well. So we do have gender-based plus framework, and even though it is called gender-based plus, it's actually including the culture, the income, so many different layers, or if you would like to call characteristics of individuals that might be intersecting, whether it's coming from a geographical level or an individual characteristic level, and it's really at those intersection that by just looking at those intersections, we better understand the lived experiences. So it's very important to again, as I mentioned, I think in the introduction, the disaggregated data action plan is exactly trying to achieve that, to shed light on those lived experiences at the intersections. So it's not just persons with disabilities, it's women with disabilities, young women with disabilities, young women with disabilities who might be belonging to a racialized group.
Yeah, absolutely. All of those factors can create a different experience for every unique human. So following up to that, as not all organizations may have those kinds of resources, or obviously Statistics Canada has an edge in terms of that information and knowledge at their fingertips. So how can a workplace look to bring those lenses into how they are supporting their workplaces, and bringing that lens to how they're providing accommodations, or those kinds of things.
I have to say, I am not an expert in that area. Having said
Hmm.
that, I do have experts among my colleagues who I usually turn to. So, our lens is usually the research, the information. We shed light on the lived experiences, and we basically report on the lived or reported perceptions and experiences. But in terms of creating workplaces, I do know that when I have let's say a new team member and who might be needing accommodations, I turn to my colleagues internally in our organizations and learn more about how I can create a better work environment, how I can provide those flexible work arrangements for my new colleague. So as I said, it's not my expertise area, but we do have experts who we can turn to ensure that those accommodations are in place. At Statistics Canada, we do have a duty to accommodate. So it is not a question whether we will or not. It's just a question of how quickly we can have things in place.
Yes, of course. I imagine all that are here today, there is a legal requirement, but it's also going beyond that legal requirement to ensure the success of employment throughout the cycle of those employment years. Moving into a different subject, so looking at the educational barriers that you mentioned and how it can be a predictor of employment later on, what role do you see, or it may have come into research of where professional development in the workplace could be of a support, or a helper, an aid in kind of mitigating those barriers that may have happened earlier in life, and support throughout that employment cycle?
So that was not one of the information we collected through the Canadian Survey on Disability. That's why I can't really, provide a generalized outcome. But from just hearing, saying personal anecdotes, I can say that training throughout the journey, life career journey, is important. And it's not just for persons with disabilities, but I would argue it's for anyone because we do need that life course learning. And if we would like to excel in our careers, develop in our careers, I'm a core believer of learning. So I can't imagine it is not useful. It's just having those in place and having access to those things, equal access by everyone.
Absolutely. Lifelong learning is important, regardless of circumstance, I think as well. So looking to tease out a little bit the part-time employment statistics that you shared, and how it may not always be the solution that it might present as. Curious, one of our audience members is curious around job sharing and if that is something that was discussed or teased out in that part-time statistics.
Short answer, no. We do not know. We don't have information, but I'm going to take a note on that one because it is an interesting, it's certainly an interesting question. But no, unfortunately, I don't have any information on job sharing except the statistics that I showed. We know that about half of women with disabilities are part time workers. Now, it could be due to their health condition, it could be their personal choice. I mean, there are various reasons, but we did not have information specifically on job sharing. But thank you for raising that. It's very interesting.
And you also mentioned in your presentation the peer rejection or peer
Mhm.
support kind of information that wasn't fully touched on in this presentation, but there's literature on. And so there was just a question to maybe talk a little bit more about that and how much that plays into this conversation of barriers or whether accommodation is
Mm.
successful or dynamics in workplaces.
So there is a large literature on bullying and the mental health and bullying, the impact of bullying, whether the individual is the victim or actually the bully. Consequences of experiences of bullying can be very negative throughout someone's life. So in the Canadian Survey on Disability, what we observed that especially among those with severe disabilities, social exclusion, feeling left alone or isolated. Those type of feelings were commonly reported again, especially among those with more severe disabilities. And turning back to the literature on the associations between bullying and mental health, we can expect several things. One, mental health becoming worse, which may trigger other related problems as well, and it may bring other negative experiences because, as I shown in my presentation, lower educational attainment that might be, for example, due to the fact that the individual experienced social exclusion at school may then trigger a negative impact on the transition to a successful employment.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, bullying is a whole other that can be a presentation in and of itself, of course, and the long lasting impacts, and of course those different trigger points and things of that nature. So I think that's a very important piece to this conversation that again, managers, employers, and colleagues can bring to these conversations. Our next question is around perhaps I don't know again statistics or again the research around the impacts of having previous issues. So perhaps someone is looking for a new job or in a new workplace, and because they've previously been declined accommodations or had struggles with disability leave or those kinds of things, how that can impact moving forward in the workplace.
That's an interesting question. So, what we show on the slides that yes, it might be commonly reported, and I'm saying commonly, but what we observed is that about 2 in 10 were denied a promotion, for example. About 1 in 10 were denied a job. So that shows that it's being experienced. Now, for those who experience these type of work experiences, they might be discouraged, but I did not show any data on that, so I can't really speak. But one could again expect that those who have these type of work experiences are becoming discouraged workers. That's just my knowledge from the literature, existing literature, but it's not something I looked at using the Canadian Survey on Disability data. Thank you for the future ideas.
I know sometimes that's what these conversations are a great forum for in terms of those future directions as you mentioned, and of course like thinking through previous previous experiences can certainly be an impact point in looking at future experiences as well. So, in terms of kind of the landscape as a whole, as being someone in this research and this field, what changes have you seen, maybe from both a hopeful perspective and a sticking point perspective for people with disabilities, and particularly, of course, the lens of women in employment? What changes have you seen throughout the years, even maybe from pre-pandemic to post, and yeah, again, just kind of from a hopeful perspective, hopefully, and then maybe some sticking points that we, as a society need to keep looking at.
So I'll start with the hopeful one because yes, there are some good news stories. First of all, I think the with the pandemic, working from home, for example, has increased certainly in general, let's say, but. The other thing I think we can add is that many organizations started to provide various accommodations so that workers can work from home. And of course, one of the specific groups who probably benefited from these work arrangements is persons with disabilities. And what we show today is that. There were differences in terms of needing accommodations. So, women were higher than men, but in terms of their unmet needs, they were similar. So that's I think very good news. The other good news is that I think there is certainly a much more awareness for the necessity of these workplace accommodations. So we have now policies around due to accommodate. We have, as I said, plans, roads to accessibility. So all of these awareness, I think these are good news. But on the perhaps less hopeful side is really related to the increase in the rates we are seeing, especially among younger women with disabilities related to mental health related disabilities. So those are going to be points that we probably need to monitor over the years to see if they will increase even further, or they will remain stable, or perhaps they will decline because maybe it was just the impact of the COVID-19 period.
And just a quick follow-up on that, as you mentioned, are there reasons behind that increase in disability? As you mentioned, maybe pandemic. Is it more that on the hopeful side, awareness has grown, so people are self-identifying maybe or disclosing more? That's just a personal quick follow-up to know if those things have been discussed or looked into.
Every all of those are potential answers. So
Mhm.
usually I give the example of children using medication. So we don't really know if the medication increased or whether we are much more aware of these problems, and then there are more medications prescribed now. So they're both kind of like chicken and eggs, and potential answers
Mm.
certainly.
Okay, thank you so much for that. And in terms of the shifting of perspectives, and perhaps it's through research or resources or those things that you've mentioned already, because just speaking to the slide, discussing what the perceptions of employers maybe are of people with disabilities and why there is this hesitancy. What is the counteraction to those concerns and mitigations, and kind of yeah, just kind of speaking to how we can shift those, so then hopefully not 2 in 10 people are being denied jobs and interviews and things like that.
We really need to turn to the literature for this because I think we have our answers there. The researchers who conducted that study and identified those individual level as well as organizational level biases and issues, perhaps their next study might be. Like what else we can do. So,
Mhm.
what are the facilitators? So, I think in general, we tend to focus more on the negative side. So, what are the barriers? What are the problems? But sometimes I think it's much more important to focus on the positive side of things. So, what are the facilitators? And we have some answers. We know that workplace accommodations work. We've seen some of the results, how, for example, the percentage of people who are employed with severe disabilities, when they have those workplace accommodations met, they're not really different from each other, regardless of the severity of their disability. So we certainly have good news, and I think we know what we need to do. But as the theme for this year, it's we really need to accelerate that action, and I think
Mhm.
we can do that in many different ways.
And with that, is the research also sharing what impacts to the workplace there would be with given again those slides of how many are underemployed or not employed? There's a huge market in theory around people with disabilities and not kind of contributing to their maximum potential. And what impact could that have to the workplace, to our economy, to the larger Canadian landscape?
It is indeed a very important research question, Elizabeth, what you just mentioned. What would happen to our economy if all those who have work potential could have worked or could work?
Mhm.
I don't have the answer, but I know it's
Continued
a very
conversation.
important question. Yes, maybe in a couple of years.
Yeah, absolutely. As we're coming to the end of our session, we have a couple of minutes here. So I'll just end again from your perspective. There is so many players in this game, from human resources professionals, of course, Statistics Canada, policymakers, government. Everyone has a part to play. So when you're looking at continuing this research, continuing looking forward, what are your hopes in terms of the partnerships and the roles that we could all play together to accelerate that action?
I'm just going to say collaboration, collaboration, and working effectively together. One researcher in a specific field will not be able to shed light on all the important things that are certainly related to each other. That's why we have an intersectional lens. That's why we have different experts coming from multiple fields. So it's multidisciplinarity, interdisciplinarity, and collaboration among various colleagues who can create really miracles to ensure that we are taking a future, move forward in the right direction.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I hope today that we have inspired some accelerators of action through those that, of course, have chosen to spend this hour with us. So very appreciative for taking this time out of very busy days to have these important discussions. Thank you, of course, Rubab, for being our expert today and bringing forward all of that data, all of the research to, again, help accelerate that action forward. So once again, a thank you to everyone that joined today. Thank you, Rebab, for being our expert and leading this discussion today. And I wish everyone well for this week and a wonderful International Women's Day on Saturday, March the 8th.
Thank you,
Thank
Elizabeth. Thank
you.
you, everyone.
Continue to learn and connect with the Work Wellness Institute and see how we're transforming research into workplace performance and health at www.workwellnessinstitute.org.